Justice in Palestine. We are so glad to have you with us. Tonight's webinar is Telling the Truth About Palestine, Independent Journalism, and the Ongoing Nakba. This is the third in our monthly webinar series, 2025, and it's part of a two-part, the first part of a two-part collaboration we're doing with Mondoweiss. This one, and then the second one with Michael Aria on April 10th, and you'll be getting a flyer about that one. But this first one features Yumna Patel, and we're excited, Yumna, to have you with us tonight. Thank you for making time. We're also really glad to be doing it at a different hour, starting a little earlier to respect our Muslim friends who are fasting during Ramadan and preparing for iftar at 7:30. We normally start a little later, but we were very happy to do it this way. And we're glad that many of you could join us when we gather at this 6 o'clock hour. Let me just say a word about JVP, excuse me, for these acronyms, Voices for Justice in Palestine, to give you a sense of who we are. Many of you know who we are and have been part of our work, but if there are any newcomers, let me just say a word or two. Voices for Justice in Palestine is a nonpartisan social justice nonprofit working for a just and lasting peace in historic Palestine. We are diverse and interfaith. We work statewide in North Carolina with like-minded partners connecting struggles for liberation and human rights. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. We support their quest to live dignified lives free of colonization, occupation, and state violence in their historic homeland, and to enjoy all the same rights as Israeli Jews in complete and equal measure. Our work is community education, advocacy, and media presence. You can find our website online. Also visit us on Instagram and Facebook. We're active on WhatsApp, publish a weekly newsletter to about 2,000 readers. Let us know if you'd like to receive that. We welcome your financial support also for our work. Opportunities to donate can be found on our website. So enough about that as a kind of a preliminary welcome and beginning to our webinar. Let me ask our wonderful intern, Kate Newman, to orient you toward the webinar from a technical standpoint. Kate.
Thanks, Mark. Welcome, everyone. So glad you could all join us, and Ramadan Kareem. I will be keeping everyone muted for until about 7 o'clock when Mark and Yumna, our guest, are done speaking, and then we will take questions live from anyone who raises their hand and has something to ask. I'm going to also turn off the chat during our speakers' time, just so please save your questions till the end. And we'll be happy to hear from everyone. This meeting is recorded, and the recording of it will go out in our newsletter tomorrow. I'm going to post some links if you're not signed up for our newsletter or don't follow us on YouTube. There will be some links in the chat for both our newsletter and Mondoweiss's information as well. We're thrilled to have you all here. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kate. And let me ask Burhan Ganayem, who is chair of our board, to bring us greetings from the board and from the entire Voices for Justice in Palestine. Burhan.
Thank you, Mark. I'm not going to take too long. Yumna going to have a lot more important things, but I wanted to welcome Yumna and Sophia for making this happen. I really am thrilled. I've been a supporter of Mondoweiss for a long time. Sophia is a friend who lived in North Carolina here, and I see a lot of our supporters here tonight with us. So I wanted to welcome you all on behalf of myself, Mark, Kate, and our board and our supporters, who are many of them with us tonight. Thank you, and I appreciate it. And as Mark said, this is going to be a follow-up in 3 weeks, I believe. So it's going to be a nice package together. So thank you. Welcome aboard, and looking forward to hear you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Burhan. I'd like to welcome Sophia, who's the Director of Development for Mondoweiss, who will bring some words about Mondoweiss and about the work of development for Mondoweiss, and also will introduce Yumna to you. So, Sophia.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for Voices in Justice for Palestine to host Mondoweiss tonight. We're really excited for this partnership, the opportunity to talk to the audiences in North Carolina, and as Burhan shared, part of my life in the U.S. was in North Carolina, and I see a lot of familiar faces in the room, so I'm excited to be here. So yes, as Mark mentioned, I'm the development director at Mondoweiss. This is almost my third year working with the organization. Mondoweiss is an independent news media organization. We cover Palestine, Israel, and United States foreign policy. Actually, next week, it's going to be our 19th anniversary, and we have grown a lot in those years. In the past 10 years, I would say our team grew from a 2-person team to a full 10-people staff with newsrooms in Palestine and the United States. As Yumna says, we're small but mighty. And Mondoweiss, what it does is provide free, completely free, no what they call them, like membership or any like boxes to subscribe. Everything that we do is free of charge. We provide news and analysis for English-speaking audiences around the world regarding the struggle for Palestinian human rights that are usually unavailable or distorted through mainstream media. We're able to do that because we rely exclusively on donations from individual donors and foundations. You should know that 80% of our funding comes from individual people who give on a range from $1 to, hundreds, thousands of dollars, whatever people's capacity. And we want to keep it that way. We only can be as strong as our supporting community is. So as Mark allowed me, I want to just encourage you to support independent news media. Of course, hopefully Mondoweiss, but any other media that you rely on at this point with the situation that we have right now. We need more voices that that are independent, that don't rely on corporate support, don't rely on government funding or foundations that perhaps are trying to step back on the efforts that we're all trying to move forward to. So I encourage you to support us and support others who are doing similar work as we do. And with that, I wanted to introduce my dear and esteemed colleague, Yumna Patel. She is a wonderful, incredibly talented journalist. Her studies were actually in Colombia, so she has some experience with the student movement. She was Mondoweiss correspondent in Palestine, I would say 6 years ago, Yumna, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe even longer than that. She then became our Palestine newsroom director. So she took she took on building and creating our newsroom. So what we have today, it's a 3-4 staff, fully staffed Palestine bureau, thanks to the work that Yumna did to set that up. And now we're super proud to say that Yumna, it's our editor-in-chief. So really a story of really taking on more responsibility, more leadership. And today we are so thankful to have her as our editor-in-chief and leading both our Palestine and US bureaus or newsrooms. Back to you, Yumna. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sophia. That was a very nice introduction. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to meet you and see your friendly faces. Just a minor correction to just something Sophia said. I didn't go to Columbia. I went to NYU, but not that different. Both very much complicit institutions tied up in suppressing the student movement. So both cut from the same cloth and just not too far from one another. But yeah, thank you, Sophia.
My apologies, Yumna.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you.
So, Yumna, we are so delighted to have you with us tonight, and Sophia as well. It's great to have this collaboration with Mondoweiss. Many of us on this screen have cherished the role that Mondoweiss has played in our own development and our own struggles for Palestinian liberation. We're very grateful for the independent reporting, and many of us knew you first, of course, through your reporting, and we thank you for that. I wanted to ask you if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit more about yourself, about your story, and about how you came to be involved in the movement for Palestinian liberation. Are there specific events in your journey or particular key people who have been major influences in your journey?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for that question. I like to call this my villain origin story, basically how I how I came over to what is perceived, at least in this country, to the dark side, which is supporting justice for Palestine and supporting Palestinian rights. It was kind of there are definitely, in like specific events along my journey that certainly were catalysts for me deciding to pursue this career. But I always say that it kind of just started from birth. I grew up I'm not Palestinian. I grew up in a Muslim Indian household, but my parents are third generation Indian South Africans. So they were born and raised in South Africa and born and raised under apartheid South Africa. So the concepts of apartheid, of oppression, of injustice, and fighting against injustice was something that was ingrained in us from a very young age. Being Muslim, I grew up around Palestinians as well. So many of my friends growing up were Palestinians, and that's sort of how my education on the subject started. But when I was actually at journalism school at NYU, I had the opportunity to go on a class trip to Israel and Palestine for the first time. And it was through a professor of mine. She was Palestinian. And despite the best efforts of NYU to kind of keep us shielded and relegate us to NYU's satellite campus in Tel Aviv and only get the Israeli perspective, my professor fought tooth and nail for us to actually see the truth and to actually go to Palestine. And I went into that trip, thinking that I knew a lot. I had grown up around Palestinians. I had studied Arabic at that point. I knew about the political situation, but I was wholly unprepared for what I actually witnessed and what I saw in person. And that trip definitely changed my life. And I was already studying journalism at the time, but after going to Palestine and seeing firsthand what the situation was on the ground and what the reality was that people were facing in the West Bank and Jerusalem and all across Palestine, I decided to pivot a little bit in my journalistic journey. So I kind of moved away from the mainstream networks where I was interning at the time, as a student in NYU. That's all I aspired to do was to, be at CNN or NBC or any of these major mainstream networks. But once I got back from my trip, I just, started to realize how different of a story these networks were telling from the reality of the ground. And that kind of pushed me to wanting to pursue a different path and eventually moving back to Palestine and pursuing a career doing journalism on the ground in Palestine for independent media outlets like Mondoweiss. And this is my favorite story to tell because it really is like a full circle kind of story. You can call it fate, destiny, the universe, whatever it is. But the first place that I actually published a story with as a freelance journalist in Palestine was for Mondoweiss. And so I started here as a freelancer, eventually got the opportunity to work full time as a Palestine correspondent, and the rest is history. So that's the sort of brief story of how I got involved this work and became passionate about Palestine and why I decided to pursue this particular path.
Thank you. In every career, there are sort of pivotal moments. I wonder what have been the pivotal moments in your journalistic career? You started to allude to some of those there. Things that you've borne witness to, helped to make known as you've been in part of this sacred work of telling the truth about Palestine.
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about this question since we chatted before this, because it's so hard after spending so many years in Palestine, like I did, around 6 years. It's hard to nail down one specific story, one specific instance that really sticks with you. One that has never left me, though, is one of my first stories that I did early on in Palestine. And there was I was working for a local Palestinian news agency at the time for their English desk, and there was a story. I was living in Bethlehem, and there was a story of a teenage boy from a nearby village who had been shot and killed in a protest. And I think he was maybe 17 years old or even younger. And so I went out with some colleagues to go cover the story. And so, we went with our notepads and our cameras and ready to go interview people and whatnot. And we went to the local hospital in Bethlehem where the boy's body had been brought and where he passed away. And the family was getting ready to basically receive his body to take him on the funeral procession to get buried. And I remember, there were huge crowds, a sea of people waiting. And my colleagues and I, as you'll see in these sorts of situations, the journalists are kind of climbing on walls, trying to get higher ground to get the perfect shot and to get the vantage point that they need. And so my colleagues and I kind of got ourselves positioned up at to above the crowd to get the photos that we needed. And my colleague, and she had been in this industry for a long time. She had reported in Iraq and Syria and Palestine. And she kind of turned to me and she said, "Hey, have you ever been to a funeral like this before?" And I said, "No, this is," and it's very dark, but this is my first one. It would eventually go on to be many, many that I would go to. But I said, "No, I've never been to one before." And she said, "Okay, well, you need to prepare yourself. This is the first time that you're going to see a dead body, and that of a young person and of a child in particular. So you need to, mentally prepare yourself." And in that moment, it really struck me like, oh, wow, okay, I wasn't mentally prepared for this situation, for what I'm about to witness. And just the fact that, and then I remember, once the funeral procession started, I'll never forget that image, basically. Not just because it was the first time I was in that situation as a reporter, but because that same scene has played out hundreds and thousands of times after that, many times which I witnessed. And it's a very surreal experience to witness in person. I'm sure many of you all have seen videos, of the funeral processions and people carrying the martyrs above their shoulders and, the different chants and prayers that people are saying. But to be there in person, it's an extremely emotional energy and experience. And something that always stuck with me was the fact that, a family, a community, an entire town and a village had lost another person, had lost a precious soul, but people were still chanting for Palestine and to fight and to fight for justice and to fight against the occupation. And so just that experience is just one of many, many, many that I could think of. It's one of the early experiences that I will never forget. And it's definitely one of the ones that continue to motivate and shape me and motivate me to continue on this path.
Along those lines, we've been talking about the importance of independent journalism in terms of telling the truth about Palestine and the ongoing Nakba, thinking about the millions of people in this country who don't access those sources and are propagandized by prevailing Israeli propaganda, Zionist narratives. Could you talk a little bit about how you see yourself as positioned in that landscape and Mondoweiss and independent journalism, the importance of breaking through and telling the truth about what's really happening in Palestine?
Yeah, of course. Um, the propaganda that we consume on a daily basis in this country is often much more insidious and subliminal than we actually are aware of. It's this subconscious kind of inception. It's the omission of terms like occupation and apartheid that blur and blur the lines and obscure the truth of the reality of the situation. It's also, using constantly terms like agitators or terrorists or whatever it may be to refer to Palestinians that are constantly being fed to us over and over and over again, right? And it's not just the Israeli propaganda, it is the trusted mainstream media in our country that are the ones that are furthering these narratives every single day, even in these very small kind of omissions, or the words that they choose to use are meant to paint this picture where inherently we're led to believe that Palestinians just inherently, to some degree, are the bad guys, or to some degree just do not deserve the level of rights or dignity that they are seeking. We're made to believe by default that, Israel and the West, they are the truth tellers and they are the ones to be believed, because, those are the narratives that were pushed constantly. And so it is so important in that reality, in this reality that we're in, that there are independent voices and independent media outlets like Mondoweiss that can bring the real stories and the true stories to people. Our reporters are on the ground every single day, bringing stories from Gaza, from the West Bank. So when you have, I'll give you an example of something I just saw yesterday, I think, of this really subtle type of propaganda that happens. I was on social media and I saw a post on Instagram by the New York Times, where they were talking about the return to the war, basically how Israel had violated the ceasefire and had begun bombing Gaza again. And in their caption of the photo that they posted, they used the language, something along the lines of, for the past 60 days or however long the ceasefire was, Palestinians in Gaza had gotten some respite from burying their dead, but now they're back to burying their dead. On the surface, you might think, oh, the New York Times is actually, centering a Palestinian story, talking about Palestinian experiences. That's a good thing. But the reality is, if you read Mondoweiss or if you read independent media, you would know that even during the ceasefire, over 120 Palestinians were killed in Gaza, that Israel had been violating the ceasefire since day one of the ceasefire. And that story was not told in mainstream media. Mainstream media, presented the narrative as if during the ceasefire period, all was good and well. They, in fact, presented the narrative that it was the Palestinians, that it was Hamas that was trying to sabotage the ceasefire, when evidence that was being presented to us and that was taking place on the ground every single day told a different story. And we were telling that different story. And so that's like a very small example of the access to the type of information and context and background that independent media provides. When you just read a headline, maybe occasionally, again, sometimes we might see CNN cover a story about settler violence in the West Bank. And on the surface, it might come off as, okay, this is a good thing objectively, right? More people, bigger news networks are talking about settler violence. They're talking about the realities of Palestinians on the ground. But oftentimes, settlers are just referred to as, Israeli civilians or Israeli citizens in the West Bank living in Jewish neighborhoods. They're not talking about the very real power dynamic at play, which is that you have armed settlers under the full protection of the Israeli state who are going around wreaking havoc and attacking Palestinian villages under the protection of Israeli soldiers with American tax dollars. It's those kinds of really important details that are consistently and constantly sanitized purposefully by the mainstream media. And so every single day there are stories like this coming out, and it's so important that we have independent media like Mondoweiss who give a platform to our Palestinian journalists on the ground to honestly and truthfully tell their stories. I remember, being an intern or even hearing stories later on in my career at Mondoweiss, of people sharing stories from mainstream networks saying, I'm really frustrated at my job. I would hear this from former journalism school colleagues as well. I'm really frustrated at this job because I see what's happening, but we can't say the words occupation or we can't say the words apartheid. Well, those are basic facts of the story. How are you expected to be able to tell the truth if you can't even say those words? And so it's just really important to have platforms where journalists and Palestinians and the people who are experiencing these stories are not being censored.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you said about the context of this particular ceasefire, that Israel never stopped killing during the entire ceasefire. And another value to Mondoweiss is that it introduces context and Palestinian voices and scholars that aren't usually quoted in the mainstream media, so they can give the broader context that Israel has never honored any ceasefire it's ever made
Mm-hmm.
with the Palestinians. Not just this one. This is not an anomaly. This is the normal pattern to violate the ceasefires and agreements with Palestine. Um, so this is another one of those kind of challenging questions, I guess, but I'm hoping it'll be one that you'll have fun working with. If you could boil it down to three key elements of telling the truth about Palestine, what the three sort of most important truths to tell that would really illuminate the basic truth about Palestine and its history and its people, what would those three be? Just as a way of trying to focus a huge topic.
Mm. So when I was thinking about this question, and I'm not sure if this is the answer that you're looking for, I was thinking of it from the perspective of a storyteller, right? From the perspective of a journalist. And I think it could also, even though you might not be journalists, I think that this could be applicable to everyone in this room, because everybody knows that since October of 2023, anyone who supports Palestine has been put in the position of being a storyteller, right? I'm sure you've been in situations in your community, in your home, amongst your families, friends, where you're having to explain to people why Palestinians deserve to live, even why Palestinians deserve not to be bombed, why they deserve to have, freedom and justice. And so I'm going to approach this question from that lens of, when you're sharing stories, when you're talking about Palestine, these are like the three things that I would consider to be the most important that you really hold true when you're educating people about Palestine. And these won't surprise you. These are core tenets that can and should be applied, I think, to any situation. But I thought about, fearlessness, justice, and humanity. So on the topic of fearlessness, from the perspective of speaking about Palestine, and we're seeing this play out right now in this country, there are obstacles, and hurdles every step of the way when it comes to talking about Palestine. There are legal obstacles. There are obstacles and challenges towards your physical and personal safety. You know, speaking out about Palestine, telling the truth about Palestine is literally being criminalized in this country as we speak. People's rights, basic civil liberties are being taken away simply for trying to tell the truth about Palestine. And the purpose of that is to instill fear in us, right? To instill people with fear, to become fearful of our status, to become fearful of our lives, to become fearful of whatever it is, you know, our comfort, you know, scared that something might happen to us if we tell the truth. There are also, I think, these internal kind of obstacles because of this constant never-ending propaganda, right, that is being pushed on us from every single direction. I think a lot of us, especially non-Palestinians, adopt these implicit biases a lot of the time, right, where we are questioning ourselves or questioning, you know, even what people are telling us when we are being propagandized. You might think, oh, well, I don't know, maybe are they right? You know, maybe is, and so I think it's really important in those situations when you're facing these external hurdles and also this internal sort of battle of questioning, is to really not try as much as we can not to succumb to that fear, to break free of those chains that are being put on us. Especially as non-Palestinians, we have a privilege that Palestinians, especially in Palestine, do not have. And even here in this country, which is the ability to speak up and the ability to speak up for what is right. And so it's so important to just be fearless and courageous when you are talking about Palestine, especially in the face of what we're facing in this country now. When we're talking about Palestine, we're not just telling stories from the lens of information. And this is where justice comes into play, right? Because I think maybe pre-October 7th, I think a lot of us would have said, you know, if we just tell people what's happening, if we just show them what's happening, people will, you know, their hearts might change, their minds might change, people might see the truth. But what we have seen over the past year and a half is that despite some of the most horrific images that have come across our screens, a lot of people have not changed their minds, you know? Oh, sorry, I think someone's not muted, but a lot of people have not been swayed. And so it's not just about informing people, it's also about you know, seeking and pursuing justice when informing people about Palestine. It's not enough to just say, hey, this thing is happening over here on the other side of the world and it's really bad. It's up to us in this country, the country that is funding the genocide, the country that is funding the occupation and apartheid. It's important for us to take it upon ourselves to move the needle towards justice every single day in whichever way that we can. And then finally, you just thought about humanity from a journalist perspective. We're often told to check our humanity or even our morality at the door. This is something you're taught day one of journalism school is, you know, you've got to be objective. You've got to tell there's two sides to every story. But what I found very early on, and this kind of happened after I went on my first trip to Palestine, was, you know, for the sake of neutrality and objectivity, you know, in pursuit of that, what's actually happening is the truth is being obscured. And people's true stories are not being shared because, you know, the Western mainstream media is so obsessed with, well, we've got to tell both sides. But when one side is actively oppressing the other, when one side is being funded to the tune of billions of dollars in order to commit a genocide against the other people, we have to ask ourselves, well, is it really important to be, you know, trying to create some sort of false equivalency in the narrative here? So it is important to bring your humanity to that. We can see that there is a power imbalance. We can see that something is wrong. And so it's important not to remove yourself from the situation when you're trying to tell people about Palestine or trying to tell people about Palestinian stories. And I think that's something that really sets Mondoweiss apart, and something that has kept me here at this organization for so long, is that not once have I ever been told, you know, this story is a little bit too personal. You've got to take your personality out of it a little bit. Your voice is coming through. Your beliefs are coming through too much in this. It's been the contrary, where our writers, our contributors, many of whom are Palestinian, are encouraged to bring their own narratives, bring their stories, bring their humanity, bring their very unique perspectives to their storytelling. And when we do that, I think we're all the better for it, because we gain a much clearer, holistic understanding and picture of what the reality is like and what Palestinians are facing in this world. Mark, you're on mute, sorry. You're still muted. I think you unmuted and muted for a second. There
Now
you
you
go.
can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. All right. I appreciate that insight you just brought us about how the standard journalistic protocol of telling both sides of the story is actually distancing us from the truth.
Mhm.
That we're closer to the truth when we engage the speaker and the speaker's passion, and invites that same kind of response from us. So that was very helpful. Thank you. Um, uh, I wonder if before we get to that last question, you could give us an update on what you're hearing about what's going on in the West Bank. The world's attention has been very drawn for very good reasons to the genocide in Gaza, but um, meanwhile, over 40,000 Palestinians have been ethnically cleansed, and Burhan has shared with us that his own hometown, Tulkarm, has been, devastated, and most of the refugee camps in the West Bank have been emptied out. So I just wonder if you could give us, um, from your reporters and from what you've been hearing, kind of an update on what's been happening in the West Bank, and specific things that we should be focused on and working to raise awareness about.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that question. And like you said, rightfully so, the world's attention has been turned to Gaza. And now, especially in the past week, has been turned here to this country and what's been happening in the US and the crackdown on the Palestine movement. But we can't forget that Israel's occupation extends far beyond Gaza. All Palestinians living under Israeli control are suffering from an extreme fascist, right-wing, and violent regime that now has even more support from the US and a green light to continue to carry out what it has been doing. The situation in the West Bank is extremely difficult. We have a reporter in the West Bank. We have been reporting on this for months, but especially in the past several weeks, we've published a number of reports about the situation in the northern West Bank, which is where Israel right now is carrying out a large-scale military offensive that it has been for the past several weeks, targeting specifically Palestinian refugee camps in cities where Palestinian resistance groups are very active. So the primary targets have been the cities of Jenin and Tulkarem, specifically the refugee camps in those cities. Kate just shared a link to a story that we actually published today about Burhan's hometown of Tulkarem. This story interviews Palestinians from the Tulkarem refugee camp and from the city whose loved ones have been killed, whose homes have been destroyed, people who have been kicked out of their homes. And what's really striking when you read this story, and when you read the other stories that we've published about Jenin, and I'll share some more links soon, is that these stories, if you just took, the location out of it, they could be taking place in Gaza. The tactics that we are seeing the Israeli military use, mass displacement, forced expulsion, the explosion of homes, collective punishment, mass detentions, physical abuse and torture. All of these things are happening right now in the West Bank on a massive, massive scale, on something that has not been seen in decades. The latest numbers, and I think these numbers have increased, but the latest numbers as of last week, I think, were that 40,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been forcibly displaced from their homes just in the past few weeks. That is a massive, massive number. And what we're seeing right now is Israel is vowing to continue its operation. It's not letting, just as like we saw in Gaza, where they kicked Palestinians out of their homes and then did not let them return back to the north. That is what we are seeing unfold right now in the West Bank, on a massive scale, and in an eerily, eerily similar fashion to what happened in Gaza at the beginning of the genocide. Israel has a playbook for this, and it is following it right now in the West Bank. And its leaders are vowing to continue moving through the entirety of the West Bank until it has attacked every refugee camp and attacked every city. So it's extremely concerning what is happening. Dozens of people have been killed. As I said, tens of thousands have been displaced. Hundreds of homes have been destroyed. And so it's really important that, of course, while we continue to watch what is happening in Gaza, while we continue to follow and speak out against what is happening in this country, because it's extremely terrifying what's happening in this country to Palestine activists, that we also pay attention to what is happening in the West Bank. And just remember that the arm of Israel's occupation is long and it reaches everywhere in Palestine, but it only is able to do that because of the support politically and financially from this country. And not just, as we know, not just from this administration, but from administrations prior.
A good segue to the last question, which is focused more on the U.S. Situation, which is rapidly deteriorating. The Palestine movement has become a central target of Trump's crackdown on basic civil liberties and free speech. We've seen so many examples of that, and just wondered what you would say, Yumna, about the sort of main challenges that independent media outlets are facing during this time, keeping track of all of it, saying it clearly and straightforwardly, and also supporting the movement. I think when people see these things, they rush into the streets often, they go to rallies, they work together, and at that same time that the crackdown has become more and more intense, people are facing really difficult choices about how to continue to be involved, how to protect each other, defend each other. What can ordinary people do to continue fighting during such perilous times?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. It's extremely pertinent, as you said, to the current moment that we're in. I know that I'm sure that everyone in this room is following the case of Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian graduate student from Colombia who was detained by ICE and whose green card was revoked, and he's being threatened with a deportation order. What's become clear, and this again has been clear since last year, since the Biden administration, but what has become abundantly clear just in the first few weeks of the Trump administration is that while all progressive movements and issues are under attack in this country, while free speech, the right to protest, the right to gather, the right to political expression, all of these civil liberties are under attack, it has become abundantly clear that the tip of the spear, as they say, that the Trump administration is using to go in and attack progressive movements in this country is Palestine. Palestine is the tip of the iceberg, and Palestine is the issue that has come to the forefront. It is the issue, it is the movement that the Trump administration has set in its sights. And it is the movement and it is the issue that this administration is going to come at and is already coming at in full force. And it's, as we know, it's not just Palestine, but Palestine is being used right now as a means of attacking the basic civil liberties that we all hold so dear. And the reason that they're able to do that, or the reason that they're trying to do that, is because they're trying to do it by, painting support for Palestine, seeking justice for Palestine. It's a tried and true tactic, but trying to portray anyone who supports this movement as anti-Semitic. And they're using that as a way to silence people and to quash protests. And they're not just silencing student activists, they're coming after organizations as well. Something that we've covered and a story that we've been following because it relates to our subject matter, but also because it relates to us as an organization, is this, what's been nicknamed the nonprofit killer bill. And this is something that passed in Congress, where basically it would give the administration, it would give the government power to strip nonprofit organizations like Mondoweiss of their nonprofit status and of their tax exemption status for, very broad-reaching accusations of, anti-Semitism or material support for terrorism. And as we know, in this current administration, that is basically synonymous with supporting Palestine. And so organizations in this movement are under a microscope right now, and they are facing attacks by this administration, and it's only going to get worse. And the reason they're doing that is because, to silence us and to silence this movement and to prevent folks like you from getting the information that you need to do to continue to mobilize and be active in your communities. Without Mondoweiss, without independent media like ourselves, as we talked about at the beginning of this session, you would be relying on mainstream media narratives for your stories. And we know that that is not a full or true picture. And so it's so important now that as organizations like us and as individuals in this movement are coming under attack, that we as a movement do not get scared, because that is the point, to try and scare us into submission and to try and scare us into giving up our rights and to giving up our basic civil liberties. It's important that we, put, put our heads together and buckle down and support one another. Support organizations, like Mark said. It's really important that if you can, go out and protest, get involved in your community, but it's also important to support the organizations that are bringing you this critical information and that are keeping you informed every single day. Because without organizations like Mondoweiss and so many others, without us, the administration is going to become successful, or is going to get one step closer to success in silencing this movement. And we absolutely do not want that to happen. And so what ordinary people can do is to continue to show up like this, show up in your communities, show up in your families, amongst your friends, speak out when you can. And support like-minded organizations when you can, and support people who are pursuing justice and pursuing a free Palestine.
Great. Thank you, Yumna. We're close to our 7 o'clock time. Let me ask you one more question before we turn it over to the audience and all the participants being able to engage with you. I was really curious to know from your personal story, the connection through your parents of the South African apartheid context. And I wonder if there are any sort of learnings that you and your family have internalized from living in that context, and then being an editor-in-chief for Mondoweiss, focusing on the situation in Palestine as it lives under an apartheid regime. sort of touched a little bit about that, but I'd be
Mhm.
curious if there are other things you could share with us about that rich childhood experience and also your parents' formation living in an apartheid context.
Sure. I mean, I have, so many stories that I could share, just hearing about my parents' experience and our extended family's experience in South Africa. But, something that always stuck with me is the fact that the apartheid and the oppression in South Africa lasted for a really long time. And for some people, it lasted their entire lives. For some people, it lasted most of their lives. And I just, there were points, in people's lives where there was sort of no light at the end of the tunnel, or when it seemed like an alternate reality or a brighter future was not possible. But people kept fighting and people kept standing up and they kept protesting and they kept boycotting and they kept doing whatever they could in their own power to resist. And eventually the tides did turn and the tides, changed. Something that I remember, my I think my mom told me this story once is that when they were younger, it, something that the South African regime did to maintain control, right, is to control the modes of media. And so they controlled what types of media, from music and mixtapes to the news, what type of media came into the country, so that people were kind of left in the dark. And people were so much so in the dark that the average person in South Africa, at least this was my parents' experience, the average person, at the height of the global boycott against the South African apartheid regime, the average South African citizen who, lived in South Africa, didn't travel anywhere, didn't really know what was happening on the outside, didn't actually know that there was this entire movement and this entire global boycott movement of the South African apartheid regime. They only knew their own reality internally in South Africa that they were trying to change. They didn't know that the whole world was kind of standing up and standing for them. And funny enough, one of the stories that my mom shared with me is when they started to realize just kind of how effective the boycott was, or how much the situation was changing, was when Coca-Cola and these day-to-day products were not on their shelves anymore. And then that kind of started to say, okay, something's happening, things are changing, something is different. And that just strikes me about how different of a reality we're in right now, is that all of the information is accessible to us at our fingertips. We know exactly what is happening every minute of every day. It's both a blessing and a curse. It's extremely difficult, I think, for anybody to be witnessing, let alone Palestinians in Gaza experiencing every single day what is happening. But the fact that we have access to that information and the fact that we can act on it is an extreme privilege, and it's one that we shouldn't take lightly. And my parents visited me in Palestine a couple times, but the first time that they came, I took them around, to all the different places to show them what it was like. And I'll never forget, I took my parents to Hebron, and I'm sure many of you know, Hebron is a city in the West Bank, and many people, it's often described as, kind of being a microcosm of the occupation because of how many checkpoints, how many settlements, how many soldiers are in Hebron, and just how kind of stark the apartheid is in the city. In certain parts of the city, there are literal streets where Palestinians are not allowed to walk on, and only Israeli Jews can walk on certain roads simply because of who they are. And so I remember taking my parents there, and they were so distraught and so disturbed by what they had seen, and it was clearly impacting them. And I kind of joked around like, well, you guys grew up under apartheid, didn't you guys, you kind of experienced this before. And they said, and acknowledging, of course, that the reality of Indian people under apartheid South Africa was not the level of oppression that Indigenous Black South Africans faced by any means. But my parents said, this is like apartheid on steroids. What is here, what is happening in Palestine is unlike anything we had seen or experienced, even growing up in apartheid South Africa, even though, as we know, our apartheid South Africa is kind of the most often, the sort of political situation that's often most comparable to Palestine. But when you speak to a lot of people who lived through apartheid in South Africa, and even scholars as well, will tell you that what Israel has done, the apartheid system that Israel has created and enacted on the ground in Palestine, is truly something that has no historical comparison. It's extremely violent, it's extremely oppressive, and it's, yeah, so even for people who had literally experienced apartheid, it was extremely shocking. And so that's just something that I'll never forget.
Thank you for sharing that. I had a friend in graduate school who was from South Africa. He was a white South African, but he journeyed to the place where he considered himself and announced himself as an anti-apartheid activist. And I asked him once, what are the things that you and others did to fight apartheid? And he said one of the things was, I was part of a group that was Black South Africans and white South Africans meeting together, which of course was largely forbidden in the apartheid structure. But they consciously met with the idea that they could model for others what it was like to live in a post-apartheid world. Even though apartheid was raging all around them, they tried to model this notion of Black and white together in a post-apartheid world. And I sometimes think that part of the depth we get from being in these situations of oppression is that we learn these creative ways to show that oppression doesn't have ultimate power over us. But thank you so much, Yumna, for all those great answers to questions. And I know that there are many more to come. Kate, I guess we're ready now to transition to the last half hour, the last part of our program, where we'll take questions from the audience. And as Kate has said, the method is to raise your hand or use the digital palm on your screen, and we'll do our best to see you and call upon you. And then you can unmute yourself, ask your question of Yumna, and Yumna, you feel free to answer as you can, as you wish. And what I guess, given the number of people on the call, let me ask that it be one question, and that we all keep it relatively brief, so that everyone who has wants an opportunity to interact with Yumna can. So I see Laura Gibney with her hand up. So Laura, please proceed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yumna. You know what? My question has to do with journalists in the more mainstream media. I've really been struck by how little coverage the killing of journalists in Palestine and Gaza is getting, and the campaign of killing all their families. And so I've written many, many editors, and I've written to journalists that seem more progressive on, and trying to encourage them, like out of collegiality, couldn't you please cover this? And they don't, and I don't even get responses back. And I'm just wondering, are you in the non-mainstream meeting? Like, are you in journalist associations where you're interacting with more mainstream journalists? And what are you hearing about the lack of coverage about their colleagues?
No, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. It's extremely striking to see the lack of coverage and the lack of any sort of like statements of solidarity from journalists around the world with Palestinian and even Lebanese journalists, over this past year, who have been targeted and killed simply for doing their jobs. From what I have heard, I have my own personal opinions on a response to this, but I think from what I've heard, a lot of people have said that there's this, like I described earlier, this kind of culture of fear, you could say. They describe it as fear. I don't know if I would characterize it as that, but this sort of, culture of silence and fear around Palestine. Palestine has always been this taboo topic, right? It's a topic that no one wants to touch, especially in the mainstream media, and especially for these journalists who are trying to live up to this kind of like standard of the objective, like neutral journalist, feel like they can't or ultimately don't want to take a stand and at least speak out against what's happening. And I agree with you. It's extremely disturbing and it's extremely disheartening because at the end of the day, this is just doesn't boil down even to who you are. It's just that if you're a journalist, you should care about the killing of other journalists around the world, simply, people who are being targeted for doing their jobs. I think that these organizations, these mainstream media networks have created a culture of silence and complicity where people are expected, if they want to keep their jobs, they have to keep their heads down and not speak out and not be political. This would qualify as being political. Do I think that that's a good enough reason not to say anything? No, because too much is at stake. But that is sort of the climate and the culture and the reason I would say that a lot of people, a lot of these mainstream journalists kind of cling to, they don't want to get political. They need to be neutral. They need to be objective. And they kind of hide behind that when it comes to speaking out against the killing of their colleagues in Palestine.
Well, could sorry, Mark, I'm just wondering though, what about the journalistic associations that you all belong to? Like, are they putting out any statements? Are they doing anything about?
Yeah. So there are some journalistic, like the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, and there are a few journalistic organizations and institutions who have put out statements, but it's very few and not many. And we've heard lots of stories, of journalists or people from within these institutions who have been trying to and pushing for statements to be made, for action to be taken, but ultimately they face a lot of basically pushback and red tape that prevents basically these institutions and organizations, journalists unions, whatever it may be, don't want to take too much of a political stance.
Thank you. I see a hand up from our dear friends Ted and Sharon Shelfie. Please, Ted and Sharon, go forward.
Yes, I really appreciated this presentation. Thank you so much for it. It's so important. The one thing that strikes me is, of course, one of the most important things all of us do is tell the truth. That's vital because the mainstream media does not do that at all. And then the next problems are get them to believe the truth that you tell them, also get them to care about it anyway. And one thing, without going into a lot of detail, that I find myself forcing myself to do and just finally realizing I must do this almost every time. Every time I share the truth, whether it's on social media or whatever it is, I include the same truth, and by let's say Haaretz, let's say so one of the B'Tselem, somebody like that who is on the ground is Israeli. And if they are either originating that same truth and or confirming that truth, it seems to me like, how can somebody say, well, oh yeah, blah blah blah? It takes a lot of the blah blah away because these people are their own people. And by the way, I'm just blown away in love with those two people and others like them, people who dare to stand for the truth right there in their own country for so many years, and thankless. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll just say, like, there's so many of us, and I think everyone's been in that situation. The circumstances that force us into these situations where, in order for people to believe Palestinians that they have to be accompanied by an Israeli voice is truly unfair situation. It's an unfair reality. But as you said, unfortunately, it's one that oftentimes we have to resort to just to get people to care. I've certainly been there before, but it's just so important that what we do in our work is we try and change that dynamic, right? By all constantly bringing Palestinian voices to the forefront validating them and validating their experiences, without having to qualify it with, an Israeli experience, I think is really important also to shifting and changing the dynamics that we, folks like yourself, as you said, that we're forced into because people don't believe us and people don't believe Palestinians. But it's up to us to continue to share Palestinian stories and share the truth. And I'm confident that one day that dynamic will change, and it's up to us to keep uplifting Palestinian voices so that people will believe them outright without qualification.
Liz Axtell, I see your hand up. Be sure you're unmuted. We look forward to hearing from you. Liz?
All
There
right.
you go.
Okay.
Yes. Go ahead.
Recently, John Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, Aaron Mate, and others have stated that the greatest threat to freedom of speech in this country at the present time is Israel and the Israel lobby. And I wondered if you could comment on that, particularly as we see what's happening at NYU, Columbia, and other places, and how members of Congress, including many Democrats, are not speaking up about any of this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And I would say that that's absolutely true based off of what we've seen just unfold over the past few weeks. Let's take the case of Mahmoud Khalil, for example. Just objectively, you look at the situation. This is a student, a person with legal permanent resident status in this country. He did not commit any crimes. He did not break any laws. He simply was advocating for a cause he believed in. He was exercising his right to free speech. He was not actively or physically harming anyone in the process. And when you read all the stories or even see any sort of pictures or interviews with Mahmoud Khalil, you see that the way that he carries himself, he fits sort of who is supposed to be the kind of model citizen of how you would want someone to engage in protest. And yet, that was not, it was certainly not enough to protect him. And the fact that he was Palestinian and the fact that he was speaking up for a cause like Palestine basically rendered all of the liberties and rights that would be afforded to him in a different situation. It rendered those basically moot. And what's been really astounding to see, although if you follow this movement, it's not surprising, is seeing Zionist and pro-Israel groups, so-called civil rights groups like the ADL, for example, groups that are supposedly meant to be advocating for the very civil rights and liberties that are being suppressed in this type of situation. They're advocating for the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil. Groups like the ADL, Zionist pro-Israel groups on campus, on Columbia, are the reason why Mahmoud Khalil and other activists like him are being targeted by ICE. They're the reason why they are being arrested, why they're being threatened with deportation. And it's been so astounding to see these sort of liberal Zionist voices who I think would consider themselves to be, advocates of free speech and all of these things. They are the organizations that are lobbying tooth and nail for the rights of folks like Mahmoud Khalil to be stripped away under the guise of, and like claiming that this is Mahmoud Khalil and others like him are promoting anti-Semitism or making Jewish students feel unsafe. And so the work of these pro-Israel groups and the Israel lobby, like everything that we're seeing unfold right now in this country, is a direct result of the work of these groups, and the work that they have been doing to slowly basically erode our rights and our freedoms to prevent us from being able to speak up on this issue and to speak up about Palestine. And that's certainly been accelerated over the past year and a half once the lobby saw that despite the best efforts of the, Israeli state, of the US, and of the propaganda machine, that people around the world of conscience were standing with Palestine, and they were standing up for the right for Palestinians to live in freedom and dignity. And that poses the biggest threat to, the systems and the order that these that the people in power benefit from. And so that's why they're coming down so hard on the Palestine movement. And like I said earlier, these attacks on the Palestine movement are setting a precedent for rights and liberties to be stripped away from everybody. It is not just Palestinians. It is not just people on student visas or work visas or green card holders who are going to come in the line of fire. It is everyone who stands for any sort of basic progressive issue or civil rights issue. Their time will come too. Palestine is just the beginning. So yes, I think that the Israel lobby and pro-Israel groups are certainly at the forefront of the downturn and the downward spiral that we are in as a country right now.
Other questions? Still have about 15 minutes if there's any questions that started to percolate up during Yumna's presentation. Laura, let me wait for a second, see if there are any others. I'll come back to you if no one else is ready. Any other questions? You seeing any on the screen, Kate, that I'm missing?
I am not.
Laura, go ahead.
Well, something that drives me crazy is the constant massive underreporting of the number of people who died and the casualty rate in Gaza across journalistic sources, even some more progressive sources, and even in marches that are led by Palestinians. I just feel like this massive underreporting of the actual number killed, which I know we don't know is exact, but we sure know it's not 40,000. And I feel like that's part of the problem. We're reinforcing it. I was in a demonstration just the other day. We kept chanting this. I think, come on. But I wanted to ask you, like, one person made an argument on some program the other day that even Hamas and the health authorities in Gaza have a sort of a vested interest in underreporting the figure, just because people might get really mad at them for maybe some think that they provided the pretext for the genocide or that they haven't been taken care of, whatever. I mean, I'm not necessarily buying that, but I'm just wondering if you've ever in covering had that feeling. And like, as a journalist, I know you can't just make up figures, but surely there must be some in between where we aren't continually so massively underreporting this. I think that's the problem, like, for people to appreciate the magnitude of what's happening.
Yeah, no, it's certainly an issue that we face. Naturally, we report on this every single day, so we've got to know what the death toll is, right? I would say that even before this, and people have their own political speculations, as you said, but we have always relied as a news source on the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza and in the West Bank as a very reliable source of casualties, be it injuries or deaths pre-October 7th, pre-genocide, even during previous Israeli onslaughts. The Gaza Ministry of Health has been extremely reliable in providing accurate numbers. And so I think it's important also to not to fall into what I think can sometimes be these traps of, oh, well, the ministry has got its whatever it is, have got their own sort of like political interests, so they might be underreporting or whatever it is. At the end of the day, that just ultimately feeds the Israeli Western narrative, propaganda narrative, that well, these, Palestinians or Palestinian sources aren't trustworthy. But the reality is, and from what we've gauged just speaking to people on the ground, is that yes, and the casualty number is massively underreported. I don't believe it's because there's a specific intentional omission or covering up of the true death toll. I think that the situation in Gaza, the targeting of the hospitals, the targeting of civil society, the targeting of health officials themselves, the lack of equipment for civil defense crews to you resurface the bodies of the dead. I mean, there are estimates at least that there are some 10,000 Palestinians still stuck under the rubble in Gaza, not to mention the thousands of other people who simply have gone missing. And so I think there's all of these sorts of factors, create a situation in which the Ministry of Health cannot, the circumstances have dictated their ability to accurately report on the numbers. Now, of course, we know that there are other sources and other reports that have come out over the past year and a half, such as the Lancet Journal, which is one of the forefront medical journals, talking about how, well, just kind of based on empirical data and based off of their, studies that they've run, and they came to the conclusion that the death toll could be as high as 186,000 Palestinians. That was the number at some point several months ago. So it could be even higher than that. So something that we've tried to do in our reporting, acknowledging that we do not have the infrastructure to try and be able to come up with the real or accurate death toll, is what we'll always do is we'll make sure to include that very necessary context information, right? That these are the numbers that the Palestinian Ministry of Health have reported. These are also the conditions under which they've reported them. So it's probably a massive undercount. And here is this alternative source, i.e. the Lancet Journal, that has provided evidence to suggest that the number could be much higher. So that's the type of context, that's the type of information that we bring to our reporting to try and give people the clearest picture as possible.
And is it also taking into account like the difference? I think with the ministry that they're just reporting direct hits, people who died as a result of a bomb or something.
Absolutely,
not all the indirect hit.
Absolutely. We've done numerous reports on the hidden death tolls, Palestinians, people who have died from seemingly natural causes, but as a result of genocide, people who could not get access to medical care, who did not have access to their medications, people who died out in the cold, living in these, terrible conditions in tents in the middle of the winter. So those are absolutely stories that we've reported on, and the very important context that we bring as well.
Well, it's also important to say that some of the munitions that have been used in this genocide are such that they just vaporize bodies. So, you're not going to be able to have victims that show up in the morgue in the case of a lot of these very heavy bombs with massive blast radiuses. So there is that too. All right. Other questions? We have about 7 or 8 minutes. Is there anyone else that would like to follow up with Yumna while we have her right here? It's a great opportunity to tap her experience and pick her mind. Yumna, I have one other one which I held back on a little bit. Tell us a little bit about the process that goes into, what is life like in the Mondoweiss newsroom? I mean, we have interaction with the people and the staff, and I know they're scattered around. How do you keep track of everything that's going on? Who are people generating stories from their own experience where they are? Are there certain emphases that you guys would like to have your reporters develop? Tell me how the stories develop so that what's behind what we see.
Sure, absolutely. So we're all we're a digital newsroom. We're all remote, working in our respective places. And so unfortunately, we don't get to meet in person, but we're constantly in conversation, in the way that a typical newsroom would function. We have our editorial meetings at the top of the week, where everyone on editorial staff is coming with stories and with ideas. And so these are the meetings where having the benefit of people on the ground in Palestine, let's say, really shine through, because we have our Gaza correspondent, our West Bank correspondent. We have people bringing the stories that they are physically seeing and the stories that they are hearing from their communities. And so those are the stories that we discuss in the editorial meeting. And of course, folks in the US are bringing the stories that they're following, the stories that they're, maybe information that's being shared with them from activists, from students in the movement. So we kind of come together, we all discuss our ideas, we've got our pitches, and then, we kind of determine as a team what our editorial focuses are going to be for that week. Of course, we know the news moves very quickly, especially in Palestine. The situation's constantly changing. So we may think on Monday, a story is going to be the big story this week, and by Tuesday, it's totally changed. And that was true this week. On Monday, we were talking about other things. By Tuesday, Israel had resumed the genocide in Gaza. And so we have to switch gears and react, act, and react accordingly. But we've got a really great team in all these different locations who are bringing all these different perspectives. And that certainly shines through in the work, I think.
Thank you, Yumna.
Mark, if I may,
yes.
about
Oh,
that.
yes, Sophia, please.
Yeah, just to say, our team it's very small, and our editorial team never works regular hours when things happen over weekends. They're all connected, reporting. The reason why you see we're not a breaking news organization, and even though that's a fact, our team reports on issues that happen over the weekend, over like the night. It's really a very committed group of journalists. And one thing that I did wanted to add as well is that some people ask us, well, why are you fundraising for Mondoweiss? 77% of our budget, it's our staff. We have very few organizations have journalists that are fully staffed. It's mostly freelancers. We are committed to having people working full-time with benefits, with all kinds of other things in the US as well, which guarantees that people have secure income and that they can do their work without being afraid or without being concerned about financial issues. So I just wanted to add that as well, because even though we are committed to supporting our staff and giving them a fair wage, they always work more than what they're paid for. So I just wanted to add that for people to consider.
Thank you, Sophia. And I did notice that Kate has put in the chat a way to sign up for Mondoweiss's newsletter, and please check the chat for those sources. I do see Jim Rice has his hand up. Jim, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. Yumna and Sophia, thank you so much for what you've shared today. I was wondering if you've lost any of your reporting contacts on the ground to the genocide.
So I personally have. I'm sure my colleagues have as well. Thankfully, Mondoweiss as an organization, we haven't suffered that kind of loss. We're really grateful for that we're still in touch with most of our contacts, but there are a lot of our contacts and people we work with regularly who, reach out to us about their entire families being killed or being the survivors of their family. And so those are certainly stories that we hear about a lot. There's a reporter in Gaza who we worked with. He was a videographer, and he did some work for us during the Great March of Return, just as a freelancer, but someone that we had been in contact with over the years. And there are several journalists in Gaza who were reporting on the very early events of October 7th near the border when everything was happening, going out and covering and taking videos of things. And several of them have gone missing and have disappeared, and their families are still searching for them. And no one knows if they're dead, if they're in prison. So we've reported on such stories. And one of the journalists, Nidal, who we worked with before, he is one of those people who still has not been found, and his family doesn't know where he is. And this is the tragic reality of the situation in Gaza. It's not that a lot of people are even missing, and families don't know where people are.
Well, when you have the chance, please tell them we appreciate their bravery in the face of this trauma, and we depend on them, and it helps us do what we need to do here.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. We wouldn't be able to do any of our work either without our Palestinian colleagues in Gaza. And so we're extremely, extremely appreciative and inspired by the work that they do, under the circumstances that they're subjected to, that they continue to bring us the stories that they do.
Thank you, Jim, for bringing that very human perspective to this series of tragedies. Friends, we're at the point of the conclusion of this webinar. I want to ask everyone to unmute if you'd like, and let's express our thanks to Yumna and also to Sophia. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Important work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Shukran.
We appreciate
Thanks, everyone.
Shukran,
Thank you.
yes, shukran. And also to say, remind everybody that the second part of our two-part co-hosted webinar with Mondoweiss will be on April 10th, and staff writer Michael Aria will be our guest, and he kind of works the U.S. beat, is my understanding from talking to Sophia and Yumna. And he has very deep contacts with the student movement there. And every time there's something going on among the students, they're in touch with Michael, or Michael's in touch with them. So we'll have a great opportunity to learn more about Palestinian student activism and solidarity activism among students all across the country. That's one of the main areas that we'll explore with Michael. Again, Yumna, thank you so much for opening your heart and your experience to us, and giving us a renewed appreciation for the power of the truth.
Thank you.
We never know how important it is until we don't have access to it. And thank you for all you all do, bringing it to us. Great to see
Thank you so
everyone.
Thank you.
Well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Thanks,
you. Bye.
friends.